What do dominatrixes, One Direction stans, and Big Pharma have in common? They all love pain. The most painful month of my life was in August 2023. It all started with a cyst, and it almost killed me. Hi, my name is avapemilione. I'm a non-binary writer, semi-reformed Tumblr blogger, and the founder and editor-in-chief of Ebony Tomatoes Collective, which is a Black and queer literary magazine. On this channel, I discuss the cultural and political phenomena ruffling my feathers. And for all of you who are new here, thank you so much for coming, and to everyone who subscribed from my last video, thank you so much. I'm really happy to have you. Today, I'll be waxing philosophical about pain and honoring our hero with a good old rant about the healthcare system. In 2023, I got an emergency surgery to remove a cyst that had grown on my ovary. The cyst was the size of a grapefruit and would have killed me if it burst. It all felt very biblical, very wild geese. But it hurt so badly that my body still remembers it. I'll be talking about my journey with pain while tying the personal, i.e. my massive ovarian cyst, to the political. In this case, meaning the broader ways that pain is defined, exploited, and treated under late-stage capitalism. Let me paint a picture. It's spring 2023. I'm a senior in college living in the East Village with my two best friends. I'm going out multiple times a week, every week. I wear fingerless gloves regularly and unironically. I'm posting on my Instagram close friends story like it's a full-time job. You get the picture. I was a bitch who could not be halted by any force of man or nature. But I had slept on the ultimate threat, the mysterious workings of my own reproductive system. Both the cyst and the pain it caused me started small. First, there were the hours of twisting, contracting pelvic pain that I wrote off as period cramps. Because I was not used to hurting in such a tangible way, the experience of such excruciating pain felt exceptional, like something to just be endured and then forgotten. Months later, at the dinner following my college graduation, my pelvic region howled with deep, throbbing pain. I said my farewells and took photos of my best friends from college, all the while feeling like my organs were being twisted by one of those factory women from Les Mis. I spent the next 3 days vomiting at the scent of my roommate's homemade meals. I was up in my room, lying in a fetal position with no other choice but to feel my body and whatever was happening inside of it. I avoided visiting the doctor for as long as possible. It hurt enough to move, let alone look up the local urgent care's copays and accepted insurances. Also, doctors were typically dismissive of me. Their attitudes made me feel like requesting relief for pain was basically admitting a personal shortcoming. I was also reluctant as a genderqueer person to be examined by doctors who misgendered me without a second thought. If I couldn't even trust a doctor to consider my gender outside of the binary, how could I trust them to treat a body that exists outside of it? My suspicions were not misplaced. The way that Western medical institutions have handled and continue to handle pain management have traumatized entire countries and generations of people. This year, the American College of Surgeons came out with a statement calling the U.S. healthcare system a highly corporatized system controlled by a decreasing number of increasingly powerful conglomerates where profit is often the main metric of performance and success. Under late-stage capitalism, nothing is sacred and nothing is safe for monetization. And in a culture of total and complete exploitation, even our pain is a profitable resource. The exploitation of pain is most apparent in the story of opioids, which were initially created to treat acute pain, but have since ballooned into an industry that is worth billions of dollars. The CDC estimated that in 2023, an average of 217 people died of opioid overdoses every single day. This Mayo Clinic article states, the opioid epidemic is the most important and most serious public health crisis today. But codeine, Oxycontin, and fentanyl didn't fall out of a coconut tree.
We did it, Joe.
Someone had to make the pills, someone had to haul them out, and someone had to charge for them. So, where did they come from? In 2018, a team of physicians came out with an incredible article explaining how opioids ate America alive. It's incredibly rich in detailed research, so I recommend that you read it. However, if you're more of an auditory person, I will be explaining this article's key points. They traced the origin of opioids to after the Civil War, where soldiers were treated with morphine for extreme pain, and then morphine led to the development of synthetic opioids. Everyone from upper middle class housewives to people living in economically disadvantaged areas began getting hooked on opioids. Then the government cracked down on recreational opioid use, which then led to the widespread use of heroin. The government knew this stuff was addictive. They passed the Heroin Act in 1924 to curb use of the drug. But as World War I, World War II, and all the subsequent wars kept raging to expand the colonial empire, more and more soldiers kept coming in with traumatic injuries. It was like a Metallica music video in those 20th century war hospitals. Without broader networks of non-Western medicine and community support, these people's main avenue for pain management were drugs that were very powerful, potentially addictive, and, in the long run, extremely profitable. Then came the New England Journal of Medicine in 1980. Dr. Jick and his assistant Jane Porter wrote a cute little article in it being like, hey guys, so we actually gave like 12,000 people narcotics and only 4 of them became addicted, so narcotics are actually pretty chill for brief hospital stays. They concluded that, despite widespread use of narcotic drugs in hospitals, the development of addiction is rare in medical patients with no history of addiction. Their claim, which wasn't even 2 paragraphs long, by the way, was wildly misinterpreted and twisted by the medical industry to fit the narrative that opioids weren't addictive at all. It kickstarted a whole dumpster fire that would end up killing hundreds of thousands of people. Interestingly, the doctors who wrote that article told NPR in 2017 that they regretted the article for the way that it fueled the opioid crisis. Dr. Jick says, that letter was used to advertise by new companies that were pushing out new pain drugs. None of the companies came to me to talk to me about the letter or the use as an ad. The letter wasn't of value to health and medicine in and of itself. If I knew then what I know now, I would never have published it. It was not worth it. Based on my research, I'd say that most doctors did not have bad intentions in prescribing opioids in these early days. They were looking for better ways to treat patient pain, and opioids seemed like a hopeful option. However, prescribers started recommending opioids not just for the use of traumatic injuries, but for chronic pain as well. So now these medications weren't only being used to treat cancer patients or soldiers with freshly severed limbs, but a broader range of patients who were describing any type of pain at all, which is risky given how addictive opioids can be. Medical journals were publishing studies with a sample size of like 40 people and coming away with conclusions that were like, hey, if you're in pain, you should totally take this safe and normal drug. It'll be totally safe and normal. Needless to say, it was not totally safe and normal, and Big Pharma only made things worse. When Purdue Pharma created OxyContin, which was approved by the FDA in 1998, the wheel of addiction rolled yet another cycle up the hill. Purdue Pharma, which is owned by the billionaire Sackler family, launched a marketing campaign for OxyContin that would literally put Addison Rae's PR team to shame. They were running their shit like a pyramid scheme, honestly. They made emotionally evocative commercials about OxyContin.
Less than 1% of patients taking opioids actually become addicted.
In private email chains, members of the Sackler family schemed to quote-unquote obliterate any mentions that OxyContin was addictive. They were selling way more OxyContin than they were supposed to, even to shady suppliers. Purdue Pharma bribed leading doctors to not only endorse the use of the drug, but to prescribe it.
There's no question that our best, strongest pain medicines are the opioids. They don't wear out, they go on working. They do not have serious medical side effects. And so these drugs, which I repeat are our best, strongest pain medications, should be used much more than they are for patients in pain.
With so many overhead costs, profit margins on the line, and executive salaries to be paid, Purdue Pharma was determined to sell OxyContin no matter the cost to human life or well-being. But rivers of blood money never flow fairly. Purdue Pharma pleaded guilty to fraud, filed for bankruptcy, and recently reached a $7.4 billion settlement with the United States. Only $850 million of which will go to people who were directly harmed by Purdue Pharma. Meanwhile, the Sackler family are still multi-billionaires who deny doing anything wrong.
Do you believe that any of Purdue's conduct has led to an increase in people being addicted in the Commonwealth of Kentucky?
No.
despite their overwhelming remorse and philanthropy. The monster that the Sackler family created lives on. A recent New Zealand study followed 177,200 people who were prescribed opioids after coming to the hospital for a traumatic injury. They found that 15.3% of trauma patients who had never been exposed to opioids before developed persistent opioid use after their discharge. Another U.S. study followed 700 teenagers who visited the hospital between 2011 and 2013 for traumatic injuries. The study concluded that overdoses and substance misuse diagnoses occurred in over 10% of the teenagers 5 years after their discharge. Both American and international studies from the last 2 decades have concluded that there is an inherent risk in prescribing opioids and that medical professionals should use caution while doing so. So, on the topic of medical caution, as controversial as opioids are, I want to be clear that I'm discussing the risk of opioids, not the inherent nature or morality of the drugs themselves. Everyone deserves a way to manage their pain, but receiving hospital care and prescriptions is still a major privilege in the United States. The opioid crisis has wreaked havoc in the white population, especially in rural and working class areas.
Huntington, West Virginia, a place so consumed by the opioid epidemic, it has been crowned the overdose capital of America.
But people of color are also grappling with substance misuse and struggling to get access to quality, unbiased healthcare. The war on drugs has done lasting damage to Black and brown folks' efforts to receive quality pain management. Crack, which the U.S. government planted into Black and brown communities, has created new systems for racially profiling and imprisoning Black men. This destabilized generations of Black families. It expanded a prison industrial complex where Black folks make up 40% of federal prisons despite making up only 14% of the population in the U.S. And most of them were thrown into prison for, you guessed it, drug-related charges. And we can thank Ronald Reagan for our racialized views of substance misuse, which erect yet another barrier of access to health care and serve as fodder for the prison industrial complex. In 2020, doctors from Harvard University came out with a whole study about the bias in U.S. opioid trends. God bless you, open access medical journals. The study says that white people are prescribed opioids at 2 times the rate of Black and Latina people. However, Black people still face harsher screenings and penalties while using opioids. The study says Black patients who receive opioids for pain are nearly twice as likely to undergo urine drug testing compared with whites, and, if found to be positive for illicit drugs, are 2 to 3 times more likely to have their prescription opioids discontinued. The study goes on to explain that the media is bringing way more support our troops vibes to white victims of the opioid crisis versus victims of the war on drugs or even Chinese users of opium in the 1900s. Addiction and substance use are criminalized across the board. There's no doubt about that. But when white people struggle with substance misuse, the world calls for clinics and recovery centers. When people of color struggle with substance misuse, the world calls for prisons and cop cities. Propaganda that Latin Americans are smuggling drugs across the border are contributing to the fascist ICE raids happening across the country right now. Black and brown people are being ripped out of their homes and brought to detainment centers over this. And it's not like any drug magically stays within the realms of just one ethnic group anyway. While opioid-related deaths are beginning to fall amongst white people, they're also starting to rise in Black and Latina communities. Simultaneously, the Harvard study cites yet another study by Northeastern University that says that the media and law enforcement are increasingly criminalizing and stigmatizing overdose deaths. For drug-induced homicides, people of color receive a median sentence that is anywhere from 67 to 125% longer than those given to white people. Meanwhile, the people who started this whole mess, like the CEOs of insurance companies, are making hundreds of millions of dollars a year by buying back shares of their own fucking companies. They're gaining control and profiting from the suffering that they created. The government and the medical industry are so predictable, it's depressing. They funnel drugs into the streets of the empire to pay off their debts. Then, the government trains, arms, and sends cops out to hunt Black, brown, and working class people under the guise of reducing crime. Then, the cops send our loved ones to prison, where guards violently extract their labor and dignity through solitary confinement, assault, and unpaid labor. The value produced by this labor goes back into the pockets of politicians and insurance companies who then hike up their salaries and create more debt. We live on the land and bones of indigenous people, many of whom were killed by pathogens that were brought by European settlers. Colonial biological warfare against Black and indigenous people have only become more sophisticated in the centuries that followed. In the 19th century, Dr. James Marion Sims, or the father of modern gynecology, experimented with gynecological procedures on enslaved Black women without anesthesia. He went on to become the president of the American Medical Association. In 1932, researchers began the Tuskegee experiment, where they studied hundreds of Black American sharecroppers to find the cure for syphilis. Researchers infected a portion of these men with syphilis without their consent and denied them treatment as they went on to spread syphilis to their wives and children. Dozens of these men went blind and mad before dying as a result of the infection. And even though the cure for syphilis was found in 1947, the Tuskegee experiment was not terminated until 1972. The skulls of Black people and other people of color were studied by phrenologists who were respected as experts in their time in order to maintain the myth of white superiority. George Washington used his slaves' teeth as dentures. When Black people aren't sick, the medical system infects us. And when we admit that we are in pain, the medical system responds by making us hurt even more. Today, America's enormous prison population are routinely denied access to even basic health care. Incarcerated people are fatally abandoned in nearly every health and climate crisis. The Marshall Project found that incarcerated people died at over 3 times the rate of free people during the COVID-19 pandemic. The pandemic was a mass disabling event that disproportionately affected Black, Brown, and Latina communities. Americans of all backgrounds are still being forced to struggle with long COVID without a functional healthcare system. The medical system has a long history of misogyny as well. I recently watched a video from the New York Times that discusses the traumatizing pain women have gone through during C-sections because doctors haven't given them enough anesthesia.
I'm lying on my back, looking up into the face of someone who's convinced that the block would be working. He's really confident, he's the expert. I knew I had given the wrong answer when I felt the first incision.
This mistreatment becomes even more severe amongst women of color. Black and indigenous women are 2 to 3 times more likely to die in childbirth than white women. When I think about how the medical system affects Black women in particular, I always think about my mom. She used to be a bodybuilder and is the strongest woman I know. She has also suffered from debilitating chronic pain for over a decade. Over the years, she has gone to primary care physicians, specialists, chiropractors, and hospitals across the US. I've come with her to many of these appointments, and most of the time the doctors just do not listen to her. They don't ask her follow-up questions, they cut her off in the middle of her sentences, they avoid eye contact like it's the fucking plague. Like, how am I supposed to entrust my well-being to people who can't even carry a polite conversation? This culture impacts how we define and talk about pain too. This is significant for a country like the United States, where over 1/5 of adults suffer from chronic pain. My friend Cecilia, who is a very talented writer and editor, recommended I read a piece called The Pain Scale by Eula Bliss. In it, Biss, whose father is a doctor, describes the humiliating ritual of the pain rating scale. She asks the reader, how do we quantify and define pain? How can we measure a force as multifaceted and subjective as suffering? Well, we can't. Not really. A number from 1 to 10 does very little to illuminate the nature and feeling of pain. It leaves a dangerous amount of room for interpretation. Without a more holistic approach to understand the pain of patients, medical staff have the power to fill in the gaps with internalized bias. Like Black women have a higher tolerance for pain, for example, or that a fat person's weight is automatically to blame for their chronic pain, or that women are dramatic and hysterical, or that a nonverbal person's pain is less significant because they don't have the words to describe what they're feeling. Luigi Mangioni struck a chord with people because this is a universal issue. Even he suffered from debilitating back pain. If the healthcare system failed a young, beautiful Italian man with a degree from UPenn, Lord knows what that means for the rest of us. I read this wonderful analysis of the whole Luigi Mangioni thing on Substack, where the writer, Tasia Mavaram, says, Luigi was laid off from his lucrative tech job sometime in 2023, the same year he had back surgery for chronic pain, and there's no indication he had gotten another one since. Perhaps he also felt his own American dream slipping away from him. You don't have to be someone who supports Medicare for all politically to know this is evil. We are all eventually forced to come to terms with our own precarity. Evidently, he was the first to face it with such brutal honesty. Why are the failures of the healthcare system so brutal and all-encompassing? Because it was never about well-being. It's about business and political immunity. Insurance companies contributed over $150 million to the 2020 election, consistently favoring Republican candidates. And just like the US government depends on our employment, the American healthcare system reflects and expands on our existing labor systems. We work jobs that destroy us to afford healthcare that puts band-aids on bullet wounds. Over half of Americans are insured through their employers. Doctor's appointments are scheduled like corporate meetings. And let's be real, most hospitals literally look like a backrooms level. Our labor and healthcare are webs of bureaucracy that generate control and profit from human pain. A pain, I might add, that is largely inflicted by the toll of sacrificing your time and labor to bosses, landlords, insurance premiums, and medical bills. The pharmaceutical industry is only one example of how the American empire would collapse without mass and voluntary labor. Because labor can generate value that pays off the massive debts of colonial expansion. Not even nurses or doctors themselves are exempt from the system. They suffer from burnout, high rates of depression and suicidal ideation, and an insanely complex and elitist medical school system that puts them in debt. But labor, however painful and traumatizing, keeps the empire churning. The cycle is a virus in and of itself. It infects our country's history. It hangs in the air of every inch of the medical system, which has always been a primary colonial tool in America. At the end of the day, I believe that we all want to heal and be healed. But the powers that be are dangling a knife over our heads. Because if we don't pay our medical bills, then our credit goes down. Allegedly. If we don't pay our insurance premiums, we're fucked if literally anything goes wrong. Our bodies are supposed to be a safe space for us to live, but instead they've been contracted as tools for a massive, profit-seeking complex. The complex isn't just a faceless conglomerate, though, as they would like you to believe. Real people like Richard Sackler, Joseph Zabretsky, David Cordani, Mark Bertolini, David Joyner, and a long list of insurance lobbyists are upholding this system. No matter how rich and powerful they may be, they're just people. And we, as other people, have the power to resist them. I don't have the cure for pain, but my near-death experience taught me a hell of a lot about how to manage it. Allow me to finish my story, if I may. I did finally visit a gynecologist for my excruciating pain. She pressed on my stomach and asked if I was using condoms or if I thought I might be pregnant. Go figure. She gave me a referral for a transvaginal ultrasound and a prescription for painkillers that were less effective than Advil. I was like, if the person who went to medical school isn't worried about me, then maybe I shouldn't be worried about myself either. I tried to thug it out. 3 months later, I found myself lying in a fetal position in a new level of agony. I asked myself questions like, was the twisting, aching sensation from 5 minutes ago duller or more acute than the one that came right before it? I hung in a downward dog position. I watched the clouds. I passed the time. I prayed. I was dedicated to discovering what my pain can reveal to me if only I could bear it. But eventually, I was unmoored by waves of sheer hurt. I wept on the leather couch in the living room. And then my mom drove me to the hospital. At the hospital, I got a negative pregnancy test.
I'm a homosexual!
And a transvaginal ultrasound where the nurse was like, do you want me to put it in or do you want to put it in? There was this old vintage radio in the room that was playing Bruno Mars the whole time, and it really freaked me out. I was receiving a steady-ish stream of pain medication. Most of the nurses were wonderful, except that I did have to ask the night shift nurse for a pain medication refill 4 times. A cyst on my right ovary had grown to over 9 centimeters in diameter, which was roughly the size of a grapefruit. The cyst had caused something called ovarian torsion, which is where the ovaries twist on themselves and cut off their own blood flow. Yes, that is a thing that can happen. Just so everyone knows. The surgeon came in at 5 in the morning and told me that an emergency surgery was necessary because the cyst would kill me if it burst. I was lucky to be assigned to a skilled, experienced surgeon and anesthesiologist who went out of their way to make me feel cared for the whole process. It literally made the whole experience so much better. It took me days to walk normally, and at first I hated being the person in the room who needed things, like an ice pack or a chair to sit on or a slower walking pace. I actually had to start a new job 12 days after the surgery, and my bosses wouldn't let me push my start date, so my healing process was a bit rushed. But I'm struck with how my community came through for me during that time. My mom and grandma stayed long past visiting hours to sit with me in the hospital. My girlfriend brought me dinner so I didn't have to eat the hospital food. My friends offered to drive me to social events. And I was lucky enough to still be riding on that last wave of free university health insurance. I learned that caretaking isn't just an act of kindness, and that asking for help isn't just an act of vulnerability. Both of these things are acts of resistance. In the wake of broken medical institutions, we have to build our own caretaking systems and practices if we're ever going to heal. I'm so grateful to the people who helped me during that time, not only for treating me with consideration, but for testifying to the fact that a better path is possible. In the 2020 Harvard study about institutional bias in opioid use, they conclude the article by providing an alternative framework for addiction, saying, whereas the current response to the opioid overdose crisis has sparked a growing movement towards harm reduction and addiction treatment, the carceral infrastructure remains in place with the potential to ramp up harsh drug approaches. To address societal biases towards those with addiction, society needs to stop viewing addiction through a divided lens. Clinicians need to better frame addiction as a chronic illness that can affect all people, rather than as a chronic illness when it happens among socially privileged groups and a moral failing when it occurs among minorities and other marginalized groups. They go on to say that clinicians must also be clear that many people who use drugs never develop addiction, an important point that is often lost in an over-reliance on the medical model that presents all non-medical drug use as pathological. Clinicians must destigmatize addiction care and emphasize that it is a necessary aspect of healthcare, with harm reduction services being an important component of this care. The medical community needs to implement interventions to counterbalance the effects of racial inequalities in medication prescribing and drug policy, and develop culturally competent and welcoming treatment settings for Black and Latinx individuals. I love this passage about drug use because it applies to medical and pain treatment as a whole. My girlfriend once told me that being able-bodied is a temporary state. Everyone can be brought to their knees by pain and disability, just like everyone can develop an addiction or a dependency to substances. Imagine how much healing would happen if we started viewing pain as a call to serve instead of something to be exploited or judged. Let me be very clear. This video is a critique on the exploitation of medical tools, not the actual use of the tools themselves. I'm not encouraging anyone to stop going to the doctor or seeking medical treatment. Healthcare is a human right that everyone deserves access to. But healthcare, as it stands, is in dire need of a decolonial makeover. Black, leftist, and indigenous groups have already paved the way for us. Along with their breakfast program, the Black Panthers created free medical clinics in Black communities to combat medical discrimination. Indigenous people all around the world are maintaining their ancestral healing practices to protect themselves from a medical system that abandons and abuses them. Afropunk recently posted about New York City's free doula program, which provides information and holistic support at every stage of the birthing process. The use of medicinal cannabis has given many members of my family a helpful alternative to pharmaceuticals. The New Zealand study I mentioned earlier noted that Maori people might have lower rates of persistent opioid use because they have cultural, traditional healing practices that they can lean on. Herbal medicine and local midwifery were cornerstones of pain management in pre-colonial societies around the world. Culture and community aren't just buzzwords. They're exceptional forces for healing. Pain does not have to be a solitary or shameful journey. It can be an opportunity to not only receive support from others, but to provide love and solidarity in return. For queer, transgender, Black, and Indigenous people, pain can be a site of loving revolution, where we can take the time and space we need to heed the signals our bodies are actually sending us, even if doing so inconveniences academic and labor institutions. Experiencing and witnessing pain is not easy, but this work must be done if we're going to share the burden of our wounds. We the people have the power to rebuild a healthcare system that actually serves us. We may not have a way to eliminate pain, but we can organize to support each other through it. The work, as always, starts with our own bodies. Allow yourself to hurt. Allow yourself to fall apart and be weak as all bodies must do. Allow yourself to ask for help and to receive it from the people who love and care for you. You might be surprised by the generosity and care that the people in your life are capable of extending to you. And you deserve to be cared for. It's a deeply humanizing and transformative experience. And after all, hurt and human is all we can ever hope to be. Well, if you got to this point, thank you so much for tuning in to this episode of The Birdcage with yours truly, avapemilione. If you liked this video, please subscribe, like, comment, and share this video because it helps me to continue the work that I'm doing. Bye!
I got busy that way.
Bro's bored as shit back there.
I'm giving emotions to carry.
Yeah. That banana has me fired up.